Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome to New York Buddha Dharma. So tonight, it's a little bit different. In honor of the passing, in Buddhist terms called the parinirvana, of a great teacher, in this case of Chögyam Trungpa, we are going to chant a text that came from him. He died or passed into parinirvana on April 4th, 1987. So this is the anniversary of that. And we're going to chant this text. But in preparation for that, I thought I'd say a few words about it. I'm still studying this text, still learning, and have a long way to go before I observe it. So I'm just going to make some introductory remarks to kind of take the edge off and give you some idea of what it is that we're doing. This text called the Sadhana of Mahamudra, that's what it's called. The sadhana is a text that is meant to be practiced. It's meant to be chanted, read, and there are instructions in the text of what to do with your mind and your voice, as well as sometimes even your body. And so it's a practice manual, as it were. It's a living manual. It's not like telling you what to do after you finish reading it. You're doing it as you read it. That's what a sadhana is. And this sadhana of Mahamudra literally means the great symbol. Maha means great, mudra has many meanings, but one of them is certainly symbol. And it refers to the highest teachings of the Kagyu sect. There are four main sects of Tibetan Buddhism: Kagyu, Nyingma, Sakya, and Gelugpa. And Chögyam Trungpa was a member of the Kagyu sect, although his root teacher was Nyingma, and also another important teacher of his was also Nyingma. And as a result, he bridges both sects. He received teachings from both sects. The main teaching of the Nyingma sect, which his root teacher was a member of that sect, is the teaching of the great perfection called Dzogchen. Dzogchen means great perfection in Tibetan. And so these two traditions, in the Kagyu sect, the teachings of Mahamudra, and in the Nyingma sect, the teachings of Mahaati, which isn't the Sanskrit, since we're going to stay with Sanskrit here, Mahamudra is Sanskrit. Mahaati is the Sanskrit for the Tibetan Dzogchen. Both mean great perfection. And this sadhana, this text that we're going to read, brings the two sects together, and it brings these two ultimate teachings together, Mahamudra and Mahaati, and is saying that these two are in union. They each complement each other. This text is what is called a terma. If you look at your text, you'll see, if you open it up anywhere, pretty much open it up into the text itself, and you'll see that after every line, there's a little symbol, two circles, one above, one below, divided by a horizontal line. Is it in there even on the first page? Yeah, after the word practice lineage on the first page. And thereafter, throughout the text, you'll see that every line, except for the italicized lines probably, even the italicized lines, some of them, or maybe all of them, have that symbol, meaning this is terma. Terma is literally the word terma means treasure. And what it refers to is that a great teacher in the past, knowing that the times were not right for the teachings that they had, hid those teachings, knowing that they would be discovered in the future, maybe hundreds of years later, and by whom, and that they would be discovered when the time was right, when the people in the area where the text was going to be discovered would appreciate it and understand it and benefit from it more than the people of the present time, the time that the text was written. So these are called hidden treasures, terma. There are two kinds of terma. One is called sater, it means earth terma. And the other is called gamter, which means meditation or mind terma. Sater are actual physical objects. It might be a physical text. It could be a statue of a teacher or of a Buddha. It could be anything, really, that is hidden somewhere. It might be hidden in the rafters of a hut. It might be hidden at the bottom of a stream or the bottom of a lake. It might be hidden inside solid rock. And when the Terton finds it, he finds that solid object. When he does, he or she, just by touching it and opening it, immediately their mind, the teacher's mind, understands what the teaching is that this contains. In the case of an actual text, they say that they're written in Dakini script. Dakinis are ethereal. You can have human Dakinis, but in this case, they're referring to enlightened Dakinis who live kind of in the ozone, kind of like Buddhas. And they're female spirits. And it's written in their script. And as the Terton reads it, it vanishes. And so it stays in the Terton's mind. Terton means a discoverer. And then they write it down and communicate it and teach it. The Nyingma sect, this is a tradition really that is mainly within the Nyingma sect. I don't know if it occurs anywhere outside the Nyingmas. But it comes, and most terma come from Padmasambhava. Padmasambhava was the great 8th century teacher who went to Tibet from India and really put Buddhism, established Buddhism firmly in Tibet in the mid-8th century. The other kind of terma, gom or mind ter, are not physical objects. And they are traveling kind of through space, as it were. And one day, the Terton simply realizes they're about to receive a text, and they sit down and they write it out, and it just comes to them. This is one of those. This was received in that way. Trungpa Rinpoche had received terma of both kinds. In Tibet, he received sater. He actually had found physical objects. And also gomter, like this. But in this country, it was always, once he got to the West, it was always mind terma that he's received. I don't know of any, I never heard of him receiving an actual physical object. I'd like to read to you a little section about how he got this. Now, what happened was that in 1959, the communists invaded Tibet. And a lot of people fled, including Trungpa Rinpoche, and he fled to India. He lived there for a number of years, teaching at the Young Lamas School in Dalhousie, India. And then through the good offices of a woman named Frida Beatty, who was a theosophist, a member of sort of an occult mystical society, he received a fellowship to go and study at Oxford in England. It was called a Spalding Fellowship. And he and another fellow Lama who had been teaching in India with him, Akong Rinpoche, they both went to Oxford. While they were at Oxford studying Western subjects and learning English much better, well, they'd learned it already in India, they started a meditation center in Scotland called Samye Ling. It was named after the first great monastery established in Tibet by Padmasambhava in the 8th century. It was called Samye Ling. And they called their meditation center in Scotland Samye Ling. Trungpa Rinpoche at this point was still in robes and very much a monk, although he was very wild in his style even then. In 1968, he was invited by the Queen of Bhutan to come and do a retreat under her auspices and with her patronage at the famous retreat center, or it's called Togsang. Togsang means tiger's nest. And Togsang is famous, number one, because it is where Padmasambhava went with his consort, Princess Mandarava, before he went to Tibet. And he meditated at Togsang to subdue the evil forces that were obstructing the arrival of Buddhism in Tibet. From afar, he tamed the demons and the obstructing spirits. And he is often depicted when he was in this time, when he was in Togsang, Padmasambhava had a number of different aspects, quite a few. 8 of them are considered to be the main aspects. And these are different ways he manifested. So he manifested as a scholar, he manifested as a Dharma king, he manifested as a great monk, he manifested as a descendant of Shakyamuni Buddha. And in each one of these, the manifestations, there are different pictures of him. At Togsang, he manifested wrathfully to subdue these obstructing forces. And there he's known as, that manifestation is known as Dorje Trollo, which means, Dorje means indestructible or adamantine, and Trollo means wrathful one. And he's depicted there as being bright red with fangs and flames, and he's full of wrath. And it's the wrath that cuts through neurosis and reveals enlightened mind, because sometimes neurosis is so thick and so obstructing that it takes some kind of force to cut through it. So Togsang was holy because in the 8th century Padmasambhava and his consort meditated there. And when you see a tanka depicting them, they are riding on it is him riding on a pregnant tigress, which is her. And sometimes she has a body in her mouth, her fangs, the tigress's fangs, and that's the corpse of ego that she's carrying around. Now, the other thing to note about Togsang is if you ever see photographs of it, or are lucky enough to go there, I have quite a few friends who've been there, it's a cliff. It caves way up high on the 1,000-foot cliff. The journey up to that cliff, you go up the face of the cliff on paths that are, sort of etched into the side of the cliff on donkeys. And my friends have all told me at some point you get off your donkey because it's too scary to be riding on a donkey on that narrow footpath. And Trungpa Rinpoche used to talk about, he mentioned the toilet that he used when he was in, he did his retreat for some weeks there in a cave. And they used a toilet, and the toilet had a nickname. It was called the Long Drop because it went down 1,000 or more feet from the toilet. So I'm going to read to you an account by him of receiving this terma. He originally went there, and he went there with an Englishman who was his primary student, named Richard Arthur, whose Tibetan name was Kungadawa. And Richard, I met Richard when I first met Trungpa Rinpoche. He came to this country with him, along with several other Americans who had studied with Trungpa Rinpoche in England. Richard was British. And he accompanied Trungpa Rinpoche. And when Rinpoche received the Sadhana of Mahamudra, when it came to him and he wrote it down, he wrote it in Tibetan. And then he and Richard translated it into English, and that's what we're going to chant. We're going to chant that translation that they did together. Now, Richard knew no Tibetan, and Rinpoche's English was, his second language. So there are flaws in this translation, not serious ones, but there are there. And the Nalanda Translation Committee, which was a group of translators that Trungpa Rinpoche put together and taught, did a precise translation of the sadhana. Nonetheless, Trungpa Rinpoche felt that the translation that he and Kunga did at Tagtsang was Terma itself. And so we chant the translation which they did together back in 1968 in Bhutan. And you can get the other translation, the other one, and it's interesting to read a more precise translation, but this is what we'll chant. And here's what he said about this. The first line of the sadhana came into my head about 5 days before I wrote the sadhana itself. Taking refuge at the beginning, which is what we do, the first thing you do in the sadhana is we take refuge. Taking refuge at the beginning kept coming back to my mind with a ringing sound. Earth, water, fire, and all the elements. That's the first line. The first line you say Namo, earth, water, fire, and all the elements. Namo means sort of hark or hail. That passage began to come through. I decided to write it down. It took me altogether about 5 hours to write the whole thing. During the writing of the sadhana, I didn't particularly have time to think of the next line or what to say about the whole thing. Everything just came through, very simply and very naturally. I felt as if I had already memorized the whole thing. If you're in that situation, you can't manufacture something, but if the inspiration comes to you, you can record it. So they did that, and then they translated it, and then they went back to England. Now at this point, Rinpoche was still in robes. And here's what he says about what happened next, when he's back in England, actually in Scotland. He's back in Scotland now, and he says, nevertheless, there remains some hesitation as to how to throw myself completely into proclaiming the Dharma to the Western world, uprooting spiritual materialism, and developing further compassion and affection. I went through several months of ambivalence, of feeling pushed forward and pulled back simultaneously, unable to respond clearly in spite of a series of small warnings. Then, driving one day in Northumberland, I blacked out at the wheel of my car, ran off the road, and smashed through the front of a joke shop. Everyone thought that was ironically appropriate. I was brought to Newcastle General Hospital. In spite of my pain, my mind was very clear. There was a strong sense of communication. Finally, the real message had got through, and I felt a sense of relief and even humor. 24 hours later, awakening suddenly, I found that my left side was paralyzed. And it remained paralyzed for the rest of his life. It improved somewhat, but he had to walk with a special orthopedic boot and a cane, and his left arm never worked very well. He was always sort of moving it around like this. And it also affected his vocal cords, and he spoke in a voice that was higher than normal. When plunging completely and genuinely into the teachings, one is not allowed to bring along one's deceptions. I realized that I could no longer attempt to preserve any privacy for myself and special identity or legitimacy. I should not hide behind the robes of a monk, creating an impression of inscrutability, which, for me, turned out to be only an obstacle. With a sense of further involving myself with the Sangha, I determined to give up my monastic vows, and he disrobed, took off his robes. More than ever, I felt myself given over to serving the cause of Buddhism. And he was sort of, I think, what he felt was he was stripping off the identity of being a monk and all that, that induces in people, and assuming an ordinary style of dress and presentation. And he married a young girl named Diana Pybus, and they came together to this country in early 1970, along with some of his students there, Richard and a number of others, at the invitation of some American students of his who gave them a piece of land to use. They didn't give it, but they just sort of lent it to them in northern Vermont, 400 acres with a ramshackle, and I mean ramshackle, woodcutter's house on it, and a totally ramshackle barn, and an old maple syrup shed that was falling down, and very little running water. And I arrived there in July of 1970, and there were probably, 30 or some odd people, all hippies mostly, and then some older people, probably my age. There was a woman named Fern who was very dotty and was kind of a spiritualist, and a few people like that. But most of them were young kids like me.
Was Fran there?
Huh?
Was Fran there?
Fran, absolutely, she was there. Franny and Kaesong, yeah, she was there. And of course Richard, and they were his main students, Fran, Kaesong, two females, American students who had come from England. Fran had been Lenny Bruce's secretary at one point, and then worked for Apple in England. And Kaesong had been in theater and was a good friend of a famous playwright named Jean-Claude Van Italy, who eventually turned up and became a very devoted student as well, although not quite that summer. He came later, I think. And then there was a whole crew of people whom a few people here know who were up there. Jack and Sarah, that's the story. Sarah, I don't know if I know Sarah's last name. Katz, of course. Cat. Sarah Cap. She had been she was a Vogue model. Gorgeous. And typical of models in those days, extraordinarily aquiline features, big, sharp blade of a nose, gorgeous skin. And she'd been on the cover of Vogue and a number of times already. And she went on to have a long career as a model. And she had been discovered by a fellow named Jack Nyland, who was an artist. And Jack was in the supermarket one day, and he was going through the checkout line, and she was the checkout girl. And basically, it's a Pygmalion story. He looked at her and said, "You're coming with me," or words to that effect. That's the way I understand it. Jack, I'm sure, has a different version. But he took her and turned her into a very successful model. And the story was that they had been out at a party on Long Island, and the party was too wild even for them, and they were fairly wild people. And they had heard that the Dalai Lama was in Vermont, which he wasn't the Dalai Lama, it was Trungpa Rinpoche. And so they decided to leave this too wild party and drive up to Vermont. And they drove up singing "Hello, Dolly." And they picked up a 13-year-old hitchhiker who had run away from home, and they became a menage a trois. And the three of them arrived, and I was in the kitchen, and there's a knock at the door. And I went to the door and opened the door, and there was this bird of paradise. It was Sarah, and she was wearing like a purple leotard and looking so stunning. I was stunned, And they had arrived, and they stayed and became devoted students, and still are, both of them, and devoted practitioners.
And Jack painted the front door.
That's right. Well, Trungpa Rinpoche always, his style was to, whatever a student brought, whatever their talent was. After the first few meetings with a person, there wasn't a lot more to say about the Dharma. And the person would meditate, listen to lectures. But, you couldn't go in and talk about the Dharma endlessly with Trungpa Rinpoche. Rather, what he preferred was to talk to people about what they were interested in. So if a person came and they were an artist, he would talk about art. They would say, "We can do this together," and he was an artist too, and they'd create art together. If the person came and he was in the oil business, like Tom Bell, he'd say, "Sure, let's start an oil company, and we can work together." That was his bird song, wasn't it, Peter? Yep. And so then Jack Nyland showed up, and he was an artist, and we had this ratty front porch, a ratty, falling down farmhouse. So first, Rinpoche had some texts, and he got Jack to create wooden covers and paint them. And he got me to do it too. And then he decided to paint the front porch, and he had Jack painting the front porch in Tibetan colors, which it still has today. That center was called, in those days, the early days, Tail of the Tiger, because on leaving England and coming there, the students had thrown the I Ching, the Chinese Book of Changes, and they'd gotten a hexagram about treading on the tail of the tiger. Be cautious, but it brings success, words to that effect. And so they named the center Tail of the Tiger. So that is the origin of the sadhana. When we all arrived there in that summer, or spring summer of 1970, the sadhana had been printed out, it had been mimeographed. If anyone remembers mimeograph machines, they were an old early form of kind of a home office printing device. And you took a stencil and typed out what you wanted on the stencil, and then you fixed it to a wheel, and you inked it, and you turned the wheel, and pages would go through. Oh, here is an interesting, here, this is it. This is one of the original, they were printed on yellow paper. And here it is. Is this yeah, I'm not sure, is this a mimeograph?
Yes.
Is it?
It's my original copy, but it was falling apart, so I had it laminated.
Yeah, you can see. And we all have these somewhere. Those who have managed to keep them. I've got some at home too. Because we were given these, and we chanted them. We started chanting them without knowing a thing about Buddhist doctrine, in my case anyhow. So you're going to have an edge up as we begin to chant this. Let's talk about what you're going to chant a bit, the text itself. I'm going to give you a very superficial and beginning introduction to it, because frankly, oftentimes this is taught in a weekend, and a weekend isn't long enough to talk about. And actually, I'm still studying it to this day and still learning a lot about it as I read what other people have written about it, including Trungpa Rinpoche, including others of his students who've studied it. So,
Excuse me, John, I didn't hear you. What is the text?
what is the text? Sadhana of Mahamudra.
Oh.
Yeah, that's what we're going to do tonight, Peter. So, I'm going to hand around a picture. Hold on to it for a second. Also, if you look at your texts, you'll see a woodcut on the very first page. You went by it. Oh, look. No. Go back and see what Marie has. Yeah, that. The two main figures of the embodied in this text, although there are many in the text, but the two main figures are are two of the main sort of representatives of the Nyingma and Kagyu sects, these two sects, because this text is about bringing those two together. Trungpa Rinpoche was very much a part of what was called the Rime movement, non-sectarian movement in Tibet. And by bringing these two sects at least together, he was participating in that. The two figures you see there, on the left is Padmasambhava in his wrathful form, Dorje Trollo, which I mentioned before. And he's full of wrath. And I'm going to pass around a picture here in a minute that's in color. The one on the right, is Karma Pakshi. He is the second Karmapa and the second sort of monastic head of the Kagyu sect. And he wears a black crown. Later, actually, Karmapa never had the black crown. The Karma Pakshi, the second Karmapa, never had the black crown. It was discovered much later, although they were wearing it, he just didn't know, or people didn't know it. Theoretically. Was it the fifth? Deshin Shekpa, who was Deshin Shekpa, the fifth Karmapa, was a guru to the Chinese emperor. I think it was Yung Lo. And the emperor saw, in a vision kind of, he saw the Karmapa wearing a black hat. The black hat wasn't visible to ordinary people. And in fact, that black hat is made from the pubic hair of Dakinis. This is so Tibetan. You gotta love it, don't you? And so what happened is that the emperor had a black hat made for the Karmapa as a replica of what he saw with his, wisdom eye, what you couldn't actually see. And that replica has been passed down from one Karmapa to the next ever since. And Karmapas wear it, and they perform ceremonies in it. And that's why that figure on the right, in the woodcut, is wearing the black hat. Now here, pass this around. This is a one figure amalgamating the two. So you can see red Dorje Trollo full of flames, and he's got a black hat on because he is both Dorje Trollo and the Karmapa in one. And this is done as a tanka. This was done by a man named Nudip Range, his father was a student of the Vidyadharas, of Trungpa Rinpoche. Yes, Joe? The flames are flames of wrath, but they're not neurotic wrath. They are enlightened wrath. And it's the wrath of cutting through neurosis or cutting through what threatens us, our sanity. And so a friend of mine once said, he was explaining the wrath of a wrathful deity, enlightened wrathful deity, and he said, it's kind of like an analogy would be, a mother is standing on a street corner with her toddler child, and the child steps off into traffic unwittingly, and the mother screams, "Get back!" It's kind of like that, only much, much more so. And how much more so? I'll give you an example. I was driving with Trungpa Rinpoche once in San Francisco, and we were on our way for the second time. It was going to be the second seminar that he was going to do for Alan Watts on Alan's houseboat in Sausalito. And I was driving a VW Bug, Volkswagen Bug, and Fran and Kaesong were in the back seat. And Marvin, 3 of them packed in there. And I'm sitting in the driver's seat, and Trungpa Rinpoche is sitting to my right. And I ran a red light. And a Porsche hit us broadside. It was driven by the son of the then mayor of San Francisco, I learned later. And Franny somehow cut her forehead. We had to go to the hospital. Other than that, I thought everybody had escaped unscathed. Later we learned, Trungpa Rinpoche, several days later, went to Karme Choling, and he went to the doctor because he was having pain in his side, and we found out that he had that my elbow, when the impact, my right elbow had gone and cracked his ribs a bit. So at the time of the impact, I had been talking to him, asking him questions about mindfulness and awareness. I thought this was very ironic, right? So I run a red light while I'm talking to mindfulness and awareness, and I asked him, I said, is that, wrath, the wrath of a Dharma protector, that caused that accident, sort of waking me up, And he said, oh no, much too trivial. So that gives you an idea of what the wrath of these guys is like. I thought that was pretty untrivial. We had this accident. So that's one of the major themes, is bringing together the Nyingma and Kagyu sects in the form of these 2 people who are melded into one. And in the sadhana, it will be addressed as Dorje Trollo Karma Pakshi, like it's in one breath, one name, although it's 2 different names actually sort of combined. And they each represent the highest teachings of those 2 sects. So Karma Pakshi, the second Karmapa, represents the Mahamudra teachings of the Kagyus, and Padmasambhava represents the Mahaati or Dzogchen, Great Perfection teachings of the Nyingmas. And both are embodied in this text. You will find references in the text to the energy of Mahamudra. and the space aspect of Chögyam. These are sort of emphases, but actually both contain both. But it's the idea that what we live in the real world, not the world of our fictions, that we are dreams or ignorance, but in enlightened mind, this world is made up of space and energy. The energy is the phenomena that arise and pass away in the space, constantly appearing out of nothing and disappearing back into nothing. Just like this gesture, these words, everything that we experience in the present moment arises from nowhere and passes back into nowhere. And yet, as it arises, it has qualities. It has the quality of black, of sound, of a sensation, sensation, taste, touch, and mental qualities of thoughts. So one of Trungpa Rinpoche's students, a Thangka painter, Tibetan actually, did this Thangka. This is the Thangka of Mahamudra. And Dorje Trollo is there. He's wearing the black hat. He's got the robes of the Karmapa on. And there are other things, aspects of this that I can't see too well without my glasses, that indicate that he's the Karmapa, even though he looks mostly like Dorje Trollo because he's red and in flames. Oh, show the photograph to the camera. Tell me when it's big enough. Yeah? Okay. And then there are other figures in here that are very important, like in the top left, the viewer's left, is Rangjung Dorje. He's the third Karmapa, he's blue. In the middle is Tusum Khenpa, he's the first Karmapa. And over to the right is Mikyo Dorje. I forget which number he is, but he represents, those three represent the enlightened Mikyo Dorje's speech, Tusum Khenpa is body, and Rangjung Dorje is mind, the enlightened mind aspect. So the main themes of this that you're going to read, and I'm going to stop soon, and we'll do the sadhana, are spiritual materialism, that is using spirituality for ego, to boost your ego, and that's got to be cut through. And there are three lords of materialism. One is spiritual, has to do with spiritual materialism. One has to do with ideological or conceptual materialism. That's using philosophy to boost one's ego, philosophy or religious ideology. And the other one is the lord of form, that's using the physical world, accumulation of wealth or aesthetics to boost one's ego. And this is about cutting through and becoming free from the three lords of materialism, because they enslave us and they make us suffer. We always want more when we are suffering from the three lords. It's also, I've already talked about some of the main themes, but it's the union of devotion and wisdom. Devotion, in this sense, has to do with humbleness, and also with determination and application. These are sort of that's the first pass of devotion. And the second pass of devotion has to do with giving up any expectation and just simply abiding in the present moment. Any expectation of getting anything. It's all about, this is a big term, crazy wisdom. Yeshe Chola. What that refers to is wisdom that is so extreme that it cuts through all conventional norms of behavior. So a crazy wisdom teacher can get very wild if the student is ready for that wildness. And it will help the student step out of conventional or neurotic mind into awakened mind. And it can become very, very scary. And there's also a theme in here of non-theism, because Buddhism is not about believing in an external deity whatsoever. It's about taking responsibility for one's own sanity completely and developing that sense of responsibility. Okay, so we'll do it. And that's right. I think we're not going to record this because this is but don't take it off yet. I'm going to explain why this is a restricted text. In order to, you can practice it here in an unrestricted way, but in order to have it at home, you have to go through a training in the text. The Trungpa Rinpoche specified that. The Sakyong Mipo Rinpoche also requires even more, but in the tradition of Trungpa Rinpoche, we simply require a training program that usually is just like a full weekend of lectures and study and practice, and then you can take it home. So for that reason, we're not going to record it, because then people would basically have it at home, and we'd be violating that mandate. Okay.